We began 2 Samuel chapter 17 last week as Absalom and his forces were now running the government of Israel from Jerusalem. And he was even occupying the royal palace named after his father in the city of David. Now, Absalom's partner in rebellion, Bathsheba's father, Ahithophel, remained Absalom's closest advisor. And since the first stage of the coup had been accomplished, and King David and a large contingent of loyal followers had fled to somewhere between Jerusalem and the Jordan River, Absalom sought Ahithophel's counsel on what he ought to do next. And at the end of chapter 16, his advice for Absalom was to have sex with all of the 10 concubines from David's harem that had been left behind to tend to the royal palace, and to do so literally on the rooftop of the palace in full view in daylight hours. Ahithophel's purpose in this rather barbaric act was for Absalom to so publicly insult and marginalize his father that those who sided with Absalom knew that not the slightest prospect of reconciliation between David and this rebellious son would exist any longer. Thus, they wouldn't have to worry that in the midst of this rebellion, Absalom, the leader, would get cold feet, seek forgiveness, and then stand aside for King David to return to power, because in that event, it was going to mean their executions. No king could forgive, not even his own son, for such a blatant act as partaking of the king's harem. So after Absalom committed this offense, Ahithophel knew that the decisive moment had arrived. David had to be done away with. So he went to Absalom with a plan to take 12,000 soldiers with him and in a lightning fast strike, catch David and his contingent by surprise and then kill the former king of Israel. There's little doubt that this brilliant plan would have worked. But a higher power than the wisdom of this renowned counselor was guiding these events, unseen, and so inexplicably, Absalom decides to get a second opinion from none less than the friend of David, Hushai. It's illogical. Absalom knows full well that Hushai was deeply dedicated to his father David. Yet in verse 5, Absalom calls for Hushai, tells him exactly what Ahithophel has recommended, and he wonders what Hushai thinks would be the best course of action. And Hushai repudiates Ahithophel's plan. Now, one might reasonably ask why Absalom would see the need to validate Ahithophel's counsel, given the high regard that his advice was always given. That Ahithophel, who was the architect of this rebellion, was obviously all in for Absalom. And that Hushai ought to be viewed with some suspicion, considering this long-time close relationship that he had with David. Not to mention the fact that even if Absalom rejected Hushai's advice, stuck with Ahithophel's plan, Hushai now knew everything that was going on. I think the earthly reason that Absalom sought out Hushai is pretty transparent. Ahithophel was trying to give himself a promotion, and Absalom knew it. Ahithophel not only wanted to devise the plan to find David and to kill him, he wanted to handpick the troops, and he wanted to be the one to lead them into battle. Ahithophel had been a counselor to the leader, not at all the leader, and certainly not a military general. If he were allowed to personally form and lead an army into battle and then succeed, he would have been viewed by the public as the de facto general of the Israelite army and therefore second in command over all Israel. As we're going to shortly see, Absalom had already selected his top general. And he must have also had no intentions on giving the brilliant, the ambitious Ahithophel any kind of a platform for power. So Absalom wanted to hear from Hushai, and Hushai gave him a different plan, one that minimized Ahithophel's participation. Instead, it put Absalom front and center. But it was also a plan that was going to likely fail, even though it appealed to Absalom's inflated view of himself. Hushai went so far as to boldly say that Ahithophel's advice on this matter was bad advice. Rather, says Hushai, Absalom needs to remember his father David is a powerful man. He's a fierce warrior. Ittai and his men are trained. They're hardened fighters. They're not going to panic at the arrival of Ahithophel's 12,000-man army. They're not going to throw down their weapons and run away. Rather, there will be a bloody battle as a fight like a mother bear protecting her cubs. The outcome will be that as soon as some of Ahithophel's forces are killed, they'll lose courage, lose the battle. And even though Ahithophel is leading them, this is the decisive battle between what will be forever viewed as Absalom's army and David's. And so, if Absalom's army is defeated, the people of Israel will see David as still strong and able to rule. Absalom will lose support. A disaster. Therefore, Hushai says, the better plan is that we assemble a much larger force. Men taken from Dan, that is in the northernmost reaches of Israel, also from the tribes in between, all the way down south to Beersheba in Judah. The army is going to be so large, it's going to be so formidable that should David retreat, try to hide inside of a walled city somewhere, word will be sent ahead that any fortress city who harbors him will be destroyed down to the last stone. The rubble will be dragged off into some nearby riverbed. The idea is a city will never get rebuilt, since rubble at the site of an old city was what was always used to form the foundation for the new one. Hushai further counsels that Absalom should himself lead this irresistible force that is certain to be victorious. And that way, Absalom, not Ahithophel, he'll be hailed as the victor. Besides, that's what real kings are supposed to do. Well, this narcissistic and unstable Absalom, of course, loves Hushai's plan. I mean, this is sounding good. So he goes to the other leaders of the rebellion. And he tells them that in this rare case, the nearly infallible Ahithophel's advice, it's inferior to Hushai's. Hushai's plan's better. That's the one we're going to act upon. And they all wholeheartedly agreed. Well, the cunning behind Hushai's plan is that while Ahithophel could put together a 12,000-man force of hand-picked experienced soldiers immediately, it was going to take weeks at best to cobble together a big militia of farmers and herders and craftsmen from one end of Israel to the other. The result would be an army that was inexperienced, undisciplined. David would have gained sufficient time to flee somewhere to his advantage to prepare a defense. So with that as a background, let's reread the last half of 2 Samuel chapter 17 to get our bearings this evening. We're going to start at verse 15 and go to the end. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 352. Second Samuel 17, starting at verse 15. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the Kohanim, Ahithophel gave such and such advice to Avshalom and the leaders of Israel, but I advised so and so. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, don't stay tonight in the desert plains. Whatever it takes, move on from there. Otherwise the king and the people with him will be engulfed. Jonathan and Achimaatz were staying at Ein Rogel. A female servant was to go and tell them, and they were in turn to go to tell King David, for it would not do to have them seen entering the city. But a boy saw them, and he told Absalom. So both of them took off quickly, came to the house of a man in Bahrim, who had a cistern in his courtyard, and they went down into it. His wife spread a covering over the cistern's opening and scattered drying grain on it, so that nothing showed. Avshalom's servants came to the woman at the house and said, where are Ahimaatz and Jonathan? And the woman answered them, oh, they've crossed the stream. Well, after searching and not finding them, they returned to Jerusalem. And after they had left, the two climbed out of the cistern and went and told King David, get up, cross the river, because Ahithophel has given such and such advice against you. David and all the people with him got up and crossed the Jordan. By dawn, every one of them had crossed the Jordan. And when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not being followed, he saddled his donkey and set out and went home to his own city. After setting his house in order, he hanged himself. He died and he was buried in his father's tomb. David had reached Mahanaim by the time Avshalom and all the men of Israel had crossed the Jordan. Avshalom put Amasa in charge of the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Yitra the Israeli, who had had sexual relations with Abigail, the daughter of Nachash, Zeruiah's sister and Joab's mother. Israel and Avshalom pitched camp in the land of Gilead. After David had arrived in Mahanaim, Shovi, the son of Nachash, from Rabbah of the people of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar, and Barzillai the Giladi from Roglim, brought beds and basins and clay pots, wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, roasted millet, honey, curdled milk, sheep and cheese made from cow's milk for David and the people with him to eat, because they said these people are hungry, tired, and thirsty from the desert. Well, as further proof that it is Yehovah who is invisibly directing these events, the two high priests of Israel, Zadok and Abiathar, who David ordered to remain in Jerusalem to serve the people, to act as informers for him, they are utilized to help confound Absalom's intentions. Hushai tells them to quickly get word to King David, to move from wherever he's camped. He informs the high priests not only of the plan that he had planted it in Absalom's mind, but he also tells of Ahithophel's plan. After all, there's no way to know what Absalom might actually choose to do. The high priests employed the services of a woman servant to go and tell their sons, Jonathan and Ahimaatz, who were staying just outside of the city walls, on the edge of the Mount of Olives, at a place called Ein Rogel, to find David, to warn him what's going to happen. Well, they left immediately, but they noticed they'd been discovered by a boy who'd been instructed by Absalom to watch for just such a thing. So they sought the help of a woman who lived in Bahrim. She had a water cistern on her property, apparently empty at the time. So she hid the two men in it as Absalom's men quickly fanned out to try to find them. Well, she cleverly spread out a heavy cloth covering over the cistern, and on top of it she spread grain as if it was drying, in order to disguise the opening. Now, knowing that Jonathan and Ahimaatz had headed off in that direction, the soldiers questioned the woman as to their whereabouts, and she lied. She told them that they had gone over the water, not over the river. Absalom's men look around. They don't find them, so they leave. This kind of reminds us a little bit of Rahab. at Jericho when she hid Joshua's advanced scouts. Then she lied to Jericho's government authorities about it. Now, I'm often asked about matters like this in the Bible because we have well-known stories whereby friends of God tell out and out lies to protect God's people, and it typically is held up in the scriptures as being a good deed. Yet, we all know that one of the 10 commandments prohibits lying. So does telling a lie for what seems like a good cause mean that the lie becomes as truth, and thus there's no sin in it? So we are relieved of any spiritual consequences. I think this is a conundrum that all believers face on a rather regular basis. So I want to spend just a few minutes to deal with it this evening. The rabbis have a wonderful, I think, very appropriate device for dealing with this challenge called Kal V'homer. And it means more or less light and heavy. And the mental picture we need to get to understand what kind of a device it is of a balanced scales. It reacts to a heavier weight in one of its trays as compared to the other. Now, I've spoken on this before in our study of the Torah, and I remind you that the principle is that not all sin is equal. Unlike the more typical Christian doctrine that often teaches that a sin is a sin is a sin, pilfering a candy bar is no different in God's eyes than armed robbery, because all sin's the same. That doctrine is neither the Hebrew nor the biblical viewpoint. The Torah explicitly teaches that there are lesser and there are greater sins. There are even unforgivable sins called high-handed that in the New Testament are labeled as the sins of blaspheming the Holy Spirit. The Levitical sacrificial system deals with this by prescribing certain sacrificial offerings, some of lesser, some of greater cost, depending on the seriousness of the offense. And for the most serious offenses, no atonement is available. So no sacrifice will suffice. Further, there are things that God has created that are more and less important in God's hierarchy of values. For instance, humans and animals are both valuable. They're important, but human life outweighs animal life. And near the top of God's list of valuable things is innocent life. Thus, wherever possible, innocent human life is to be preserved, even if the circumstances aren't ideal. And we're not going to be dealing this evening with the criminally guilty human life in our little detour here. The principle of Kal V'homer says that we will encounter circumstances whereby we must choose between sins. So we should choose to intentionally commit the lesser sin in order to avoid the greater sin. I've given the humorous, at least it's humorous to men, stereotypical example of the overweight wife who asks her husband if she looks fat in that new dress. To which the answer must always be no if there's going to be family harmony. I've also given the sobering example of many good people in Germany in World War II who hid Jews from being murdered by the Nazis, all the while lying to their local government authorities that they didn't know the whereabouts of those missing Jews. In the first case, the lie was an act of chesed. It was loving kindness to save the feelings and self-esteem of a wife. In the second case, the lie was literally to preserve innocent life. But does the lie become as truth in God's eyes because it has a noble purpose? No, it doesn't. Nothing in scriptures implies such a thing. The lie remains a lie, and therefore it remains a sin. But consider the reverse. The husband well knows, on the one hand, that his wife does look a little in that dress. And he also knows that although his wife's feelings and sense of worth would be harmed by a frank answer, he determines he has no choice but to tell the truth, or he would be guilty of the sin of lying. What if a German who knows the whereabouts of those innocent Jews in hiding, because he's hiding them, tells the authorities where they are just because they ask? Because as a Christian, he's been instructed that it's a sin to lie as well as a sin to disobey your human government. That's all explained to us in the New Testament. So the principle of Kal V'homer says that if we're to take this approach, we have to choose to commit a greater sin in order to avoid committing a lesser sin. And the greater sin is that we would be more concerned with the consequences of our own trespasses against God's commandments than in upholding the most foundational tenet of all true biblical religion, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves and to put their well-being above our own. On God's balanced scales, saving innocent life carries more weight than strict adherence to the Torah prohibition against lying to our fellow man. Loving our wives and showing them chesed carries more weight than strict adherence to the Torah prohibition against lying. The woman in Bahrain who hid the priest's sons who were in the process of warning David in order to save God's anointed one from death at the hands of his evil son Absalom told a lie, and she defied her government authorities. But in the so doing, she preserved innocent life. And she chose to stand with God's anointed above a humanly contrived government. She only had two choices: tell the soldiers the truth or lie to them. She did the right thing for the right reasons, even though in doing so she knowingly committed the lesser sin to avoid the greater. See, this is the condition that we as mankind find ourselves in, whether you're a believer or you're not a believer. And it's going to be so until Messiah returns, until he rids the world of evil, and until mankind is no longer faced with these kinds of sad choices. And thank God, this Messiah, Yeshua, he has paid the price for both our lesser and our greater sins until he comes back. And we have a God who is not mechanically legalistic. He is merciful. He looks at the spirit underlying all of his commandments. He looks at the heart of his worshipers who follow him in obedience. Well, sometime after the soldiers left and the coast was clear, the woman helped Jonathan and Ahimaaz out of the cistern, and they went and they found David. They gave him the message. And notice that verse 21 makes it clear that the part of the message that David must immediately act upon is what Ahithophel said to Absalom. Because if Absalom chose to carry out Hushai's plan, there was no particular hurry, as quite some time was going to pass before this much larger army that Hushai suggested could even be assembled, which, by the way, was Hushai's intent all along. Now, David was at this time on the west bank of the Jordan River. But now he will take his followers and he will cross over to the Transjordan, the east side. Taking no chances, the entire group made their move in the nighttime. Well, back in Jerusalem, it became clear to Ahithophel that Absalom was not going to follow his advice and pursue David, and he instinctively knew that the entire revolution was now going to collapse in failure. As Bathsheba's grandfather, Ahithophel was a very bitter, vindictive man. He had dedicated the remainder of his days to ruining David for defiling his lovely granddaughter, and so bringing great dishonor and shame upon his entire family. Failed revolutions don't generally end well for those who lead them. Ahithophel, as do many people in all eras, decided that he was not going to give King David the satisfaction of determining the time and means of his end, so he took control. He went back to his hometown, delivered his last will and testament, then he committed suicide by strangulation, probably hanging, but that's a mere guess. Now, verse 24 tells us, without any explanation, that David chose to use Mahanaim as his temporary capital and his headquarters. Now, it's a bit surprising that David would choose this place, and one has to assume that it was at least partly because he could get to it pretty rapidly from wherever it was they were hanging out. The thing is that Mahanaim was where Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth had set up his capital. So there would have been a very heavy Benjamite influence there. And many of the residents were undoubtedly still loyal to Saul's family, and therefore none too pleased to host King David. However, this was a well-fortified walled city. It was also a Levitical city of refuge. In some ways appropriate for the situation, isn't it? Where theoretically, everybody within those walls would, by law, be held safe from all those outside who wanted to harm them. Did David actually think that perhaps his son Absalom would obey the Torah law and allow David and his followers to remain there and to not attack the city because it had a special religious status? Maybe. Mahanaim had always been a special place for Israel because it was there that Yaakov, upon returning from Mesopotamia to Canaan, had another encounter with angels just before he had his reunion with Esau. You remember that story? Well, verse 25 explains that it was a good thing that David made haste and planned for the worst, because no sooner had he and his people arrived in Mahanaim, Absalom, leading his army, crossed over the Jordan River in hot pursuit. Now, apparently, Absalom didn't follow the advice of either Ahithophel or Hushai. He just kind of created a hybrid plan of the two. He personally led the army, as advised by Hushai, but he also brought with him a smaller force that he could muster immediately, as advised by Ahithophel. The result seemed to indicate that the force composition was something of his own choosing, and the troops he chose, well, let's just say they weren't particularly adept at war. Further, he put a fellow named Amasa in charge of the army. Now, who this Amasa is, we're not entirely clear. Here it says that he is the son of a man named Yitra the Israelite. But in 1 Chronicles 2, it says he is the son of Yeter the Ishmaelite. Big difference. While there is not full agreement on this matter, most Hebrew scholars say that his father was an Ishmaelite, an Arab. But his mother was Abigail, who was a Hebrew. Very likely this was an illegitimate relationship. And so legally, Amasa was an illegitimate cousin of Joab's. Well, anyway, this might explain why it is logical that it says Joab, the head of David's army, cast his loyalty to David. His cousin Amasa would do the opposite and cast his loyalty to David's enemy. There would be a natural animosity and rivalry between these cousins, especially as it pertained to power and position. Well, we're told that Israel and Avshalom pitched camp in the land of Gilead. Now, Israel in this instance is a very general term that meant Absalom's army that had recruits from all the various 12 tribes. It says they camped in Gilead. Now, likely this is referring to an area around the city of Yavesh Gilead, north of David's stronghold of Mahanaim. That would have made sense because Jabesh Gilead always had close ties with the tribe of Benjamin, associated themselves to the northern tribal confederation, and would have been among those tribes that had the least interest in being loyal to David, a Judahite. So they would have welcomed the enemy of David, even if that enemy was David's son. Now we're also told that 3 prominent men brought every manner of supplies to David and his followers in Mahanaim. No doubt these were not the only 3. But most Hebrew scholars see these 3 as representative of certain groups or categories of people who remain loyal to King David. Or at least they made the bet that in the end David would be the eventual winner in this epic struggle with his son. Shovi came from Rabbah, the capital city of Ammon. He was actually a relative of David's, but he represented the extreme border inhabitants of Israel, foreigners actually, who preferred David as an ally. Machir was from Lo-Devar. He was a former loyalist to King Saul, but now he was part of a group of Israelites who readily accepted David as their king. Barzillai was from the area of Gilead. He represented the wealthy landowners of the region, who also felt that their best interest lay with King David continuing on. So the idea of this extensive description that we get of men and supplies is to show that David was not without support, nor despite his age and his badly bruised reputation from all of his infamous deeds, mainly surrounding Bathsheba and the fallout from all that. There were all these various clans and families of Israel that were still ready to accept Absalom as their king. And along with these supplies, apparently there came a significant number of volunteers ready to fight alongside King David. Let's move on to 2 Samuel chapter 18. Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 18. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we're at page 353. David took a census of the people who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and of hundreds. Then David dispatched the people, a third of them under the command of Joab, a third under Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I will also go out with you myself. But the people replied, don't go out, because if we flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. So it is better now that you stay in the city and be ready if we need help. The king answered them, I'll do whatever you think best. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the people went out by the hundreds and by the thousands. The king gave orders to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, for my sake, deal gently with young Absalom. All the people were listening when the king gave all the commanders this order concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the field against Israel. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were defeated there by David's servants. There was a terrible slaughter that day of 20,000 men. For the battle there was spread all over the countryside. The forest devoured more people that day than did the sword. Absalom happened to meet some of David's servants. Absalom was riding his mule, and as the mule walked under the thick branches of a big terebinth tree, his head got caught in the terebinth, so that he was left hanging between the earth and the sky as the mule went on from underneath him. Someone saw it and went and told Joab, "I saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth." And Joab asked the man who told him, "Here now, you saw it. Why didn't you strike him to the ground then and there? I would have had to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt besides." And the man replied to Joab, "Even if I were to get 1,000 pieces of silver, I still wouldn't raise my hand against the son of a king. After all, while we were listening, the king ordered you, Abishai and Ittai, be careful no one touches young Absalom. Or if I had pretended that I didn't know, the king would have known otherwise anyway, and you wouldn't have interceded for me either." And Joab said, "I can't waste time arguing with you." He took 3 darts in his hand and rammed them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive, hanging from that terebinth. Then Joab's 10 young armor-bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Joab sounded the shofar, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, because Joab held back the troops. They took Absalom and threw him into a big pit in the forest and piled a big heap of stones over him. All Israel fled, each one to his tent. In his own lifetime, Absalom had taken and raised for himself the pillar which stands in the king's valley, because he said, "I don't have a son to preserve the memory of my name." So he named the pillar after himself, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, he said, "Let me run now and bring news to the king that Adonai has judged in his favor by releasing him from his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You are not to be the one to bring the news today. You can convey news another day, but today you will not bring news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Ethiopian, "Go tell the king what you saw." The Ethiopian bowed to Joab, and then he ran off. But Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, Come what may, please let me also run after the Ethiopian." And Joab answered, "Why do you want to run, my son? You won't receive any reward for bringing the news." "I don't care. Whatever happens, I want to run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the road through the desert flats, and he outran the Ethiopian. David was sitting between the 2 gates. A watchman went up to the roof of the gate and out into the wall, and he raised his eyes and he looked. He saw there a man running by himself. The watchman cried out and he told the king, and the king said, "If he's alone, he has good news to tell." And as he ran along and he came close, the watchman saw another man running, and he called to the gatekeeper, "There's another man running by himself." The king said, "Oh, he too then must have good news." The watchman said, "The first one runs like Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." The king said, "He's a good man. He'll come with good news." Ahimaaz called to the king, "Shalom!" Then he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground, and he said, "Blessed be Adonai your God, who's handed over the men who rebelled against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is everything all right with young Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a big commotion. I didn't know what it was." The king said, "Go, stand over there." So he went and stood there. Then up came the Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian said, "There's good news for my lord the king, for Adonai has judged in your favor and rid you of all those who rebelled against you." The king asked the Ethiopian, "Is everything all right with young Absalom?" The Ethiopian answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rebel against you in order to harm you be as that young man is." We need to pause, take a broad view at this point. What began as a war of rebellion has just turned into a civil war. See, this was the fear that the now deceased Ahithophel tried to impart to Absalom. It was one thing for a usurper to gain the backing of the right people, to convince the general population to either help him or to just sit it out, get out of the way, in his effort to gain the throne. This was a purely political battle. It was fought between two politicians. But it's quite another thing when a country divides itself into two factions. One side backing one king, the other side backing the other king, and they were willing to fight to see their man and their faction win, because for them this was more now of a cause than it was about self-serving political ambitions between two men. David, despite all his flaws, was still popular enough to command the respect of many tribal princes and many clan leaders, and of the top military leaders, and apparently of a goodly amount of trained soldiers. And since the Lord was not yet through with David, the outcome of all this was inevitable. The meaning of David taking a census, we have to take it in military terms. It was usual for a king or a military commander to take a census of his army immediately before a significant battle, not so much to determine the size of the force, he already had a pretty good idea of that, but to record names, to pair them up in battle units that could be assigned to the commanders. It was both a means of organization and a means to later determine how many casualties had been sustained, how many troops became captive of the enemy. So Absalom had a sizable force, probably larger than David's, but mostly they were ill-trained and undisciplined and probably only served because they were politically forced into it. David's army were led by professionals. They consisted of volunteers who, by their own free will, chose to risk their lives for God's anointed king. And they had confidence that since David was perhaps the most revered Israelite military leader since Joshua, he'd prevail. And using a standard Israeli military tactic, David divided his troops into 3 divisions, led by Yoav, David's commanding general for the past 30 years now. His brother, his longtime commander Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite, probably a former Philistine. All these who had been with David since the days he was on the run from King Saul, these were the men that commanded the units. They were highly skilled generals. They were leading experienced, dedicated troops, but they were outnumbered by Absalom. So when David declared he planned to personally lead them into battle, he was firmly rebuffed by the army. By now, he was an old man, years removed from the battlefield. He was living on a reputation. The reality is that he had been a passive, sedentary monarch for at least 20 years. Just as David knew his dear elderly friend and counselor Hushai, who would have valiantly followed David out into the wilderness, but he would also have been mostly a burden, so David refused to allow him to come. The army commanders now felt that same way about King David. Oh, ouch. They respected him. But the physical realities of aging catch up to everybody at some point. So they told him, you know what, you're just too valuable to come with us. The risk of your death is just too great. Besides, as they rightly pointed out, David remaining alive, that was the real issue. That was the crucial issue. For Absalom could not become the undisputed king, you see, till his father David was dead. As long as David lived, the matter remained unsettled. Killing even 10,000 of David's soldiers. Well, that might have looked good on Absalom's resume, but it still would have left him short of the absolutely necessary goal, a dead David. David accepted their verdict. He hailed them as they marched out the city gates of Mahanaim to war. But David had an ulterior motive for standing by those gates that almost any parent could understand. That motive had no place in the mind or mouth of a man who still wanted to be God's anointed king over God's chosen people. David wanted every last soldier who walked by him to know no harm was to come to Absalom. He made it clear to his three commanders. He made it clear to all who were within earshot, go gently with my son Absalom. Well, a divinely anointed leader who freely chooses to enter into the service of God no longer has that luxury of putting his family above everything else. David had been putting his family above his duties to God for a very long time. The outcome was disastrous. It's long been a Christian saying, God comes first, then second my family. But you know, my personal observation is that in practice, the order is almost always reversed. In fact, those Christian leaders who do not reverse it are usually roundly criticized by the church in general for being so callous and uncaring towards their families and therefore behaving in what they would think is an ungodly manner. Our Savior has always warned, following him is going to exact a cost. And that cost needs to be counted before you make that commitment to him. That cost doesn't just come upon the one who chooses him. It spills over on your family. Don't ever think it doesn't. Luke 14, 26 through 33 says this. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother and his wife and his children and his brothers and his sisters, yes, even his own life besides it, he can't be my disciple. Whoever doesn't carry his own execution stake and come after me, he can't be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Don't you sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough capital to complete it? If you don't, then when you've laid the foundation but you can't finish it, all the onlookers start making fun of you. And they say, this is the man who began to build, but he couldn't finish. Or again, suppose one king is going out to wage a war with another king. Doesn't the first one sit down and consider whether he, with his 10,000 troops, has enough strength to meet the other one who's coming against him with 20,000 troops? If he hasn't, then while the other one is still far away, he needs to send a delegation to inquire about terms for peace. So every one of you who doesn't renounce all that he has, you cannot be my disciple. Also in the book of Luke, our Messiah said this, in Luke 9, 57 through 62. As they were traveling on the road, a man said to him, I'll follow you wherever you go. Yeshua answered him, well, the foxes have holes. The birds flying about, they have nests. But the Son of Man has no home of his own. To another he said, follow me. But that man replied to him, sir, first let me go away and bury my father. And Yeshua said, let the dead bury their own dead. You go and proclaim the kingdom of God. But another one said, I'll follow you, sir. But first let me say goodbye to all the people at home. And to him Yeshua said, no one who puts his hand to the plow and keeps looking back is even fit to serve the kingdom of God. We'll continue with this story next week. Please rise.